Hello, my name is Michael Cesarini, and today I will be presenting about classic rhetoric and 4 of the 9 total sections we learned this semester. My goal today will be to tell the audience just how much rhetoric has evolved throughout the years, but also been preserved by very important and famous rhetoricians who have contributed to the field, but also given us what we know as rhetoric today. Today I will be talking about traditional and conceptual rhetoric, rhetoric within the Roman period, Judeo-Christian rhetoric, and Greek rhetoric within the Middle Ages. So to start, I will be talking about traditional and conceptual rhetoric. Traditional rhetoric is communication among illiterate cultures. So it is also necessary for these cultures to be somewhat untouched by the Western world. Traditional rhetoric was used to reach a common understanding and cannot be used for political tasks or persuasion, much as the opportunity for either is low in comparison to other societies. Traditional rhetoric is still used today in different areas of the world that still have not modernized in the same way the West has. So traditional rhetoric is really for more primal instincts and more primal communication among groups that have not evolved or modernized in the way that we are used to in the West, here in the West. And so traditional rhetoric is used by tribes and by other form of primal and primitive societies and they use this to come up with a consensus or kind of take votes in a sense to agree and disagree on different rules, different customs, and even traditions throughout the society. Conceptual rhetoric, on the other hand, consists of a much more sophisticated type of rhetoric, including words like letteratorizzazione, which describes the change of rhetoric being used for purpose compared to being used for leisure and art. So what letteratorizzazione actually means is it was the change from rhetoric being used in law courts and being used to persuade people to get over on them or in any kind of law and official manner. Now, with letteratorizzazione, this has allowed rhetoricians to use rhetoric for personal narration, for more creative things, more artistic things, which kind of really diverted from all business in rhetoric to kind of this new wave of art and human expression, which will help evolve which will come back and help evolve in later eras, as well as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and other eras such as that type. Primary and secondary rhetoric exists within conceptual rhetoric, but we'll talk about that on the next slide. Homeric poets helped begin the process of narratives and storytelling, even if just verbally. Homeric poets were poets within ancient Greece who actually heard stories and were able to memorize them and tell them to arrays of audiences with thousands, maybe even hundreds of people. Thousands might be an exaggeration, but hundreds of people. And word by word, they would tell these stories off the top of their brain. And eventually they were written down. But this was the beginning of rhetoric being used in a more of an artistic sense and more of a sense of storytelling than it normally was used, which was for law courts and persuasion and things that were a lot more business-centric. As for primary and secondary rhetoric, within conceptual rhetoric, there is a primary and secondary. Primary rhetoric is something that is spoken, as an act. So speaking or presenting in any form would be considered primary rhetoric because you are actually acting out what you are trying to say. Secondary rhetoric, however, is rhetoric in the form of symbol, statement, or even art. So this could be a painting. This could be a narration. This could be any really collection of something that tells a story from your point of view or from anyone's point of view. Rhetoric in the Roman period is the next period we come across. Hermagoras of Temnos' handbook was an inspiration to many within the field, most notably Cicero, who reconstructed these works. Cicero actually went back and reconstructed Hermagoras' handbook, which consisted of the 5 canons of rhetoric, which will come up later, but were incredibly important. Cicero's invention was inspired by Hermagoras' 5 canons of rhetoric, which he helped to reconstruct and modernize with his own time. So he helped to kind of bring these 5 canons, which we'll list out, I think, on the next slide, but he helped bring these 5 canons of rhetoric into his era and helped modernize them into the next era of rhetoric, which also goes with preserving. Quintilian was a benevolent teacher who genuinely cared for his students and believed orator style should be mainly based upon the orator's skill. While on the other hand, Cicero believed they should be used more subtly and conservatively. He didn't really think you should sell your entire argument based off your hand gestures. Quintilian was a key contributor to incorporating rhetoric into the primary education system because of his belief that great rhetoricians went on to become societal leaders or highly responsible and educated citizens. So Quintilian was a huge part of taking rhetoric and making it less of a private practice and less of a tutored practice, and bringing it into public life. Because he thought that rhetoric itself could not only provide people with the ability to speak the way they want to and express themselves they want to, but allow them to think more critically. And this would lead to people becoming more outstanding members of society because they would be able to see the benefit of becoming an outstanding member of society. The 5 canons of rhetoric, as we mentioned before, were originally were translated by Cicero into his modern era, and these are them. The first one is the invention or reason of truth. The second one is the orator's arrangement of his argument or the order in which it is presented. The third one is the style and ability to use persuasive words and pick up on crucial points. The fourth, memory or the orator's ability to memorize data or facts to support the argument. And 5, the delivery or the orator's overall ability to get the message across. These are still all, as you can see, all very much still in play today. Whether you're a teacher, a politician, or anyone who really has to public speak, these 5 still are very much included and very much used to grade modern day speakers. So you can see the effect that Cicero had when he preserved these works and translated them into the next era. It allowed us to continue to bring them into the succeeding eras as time went on, and it still exists today, which is pretty interesting. Now next is the Judeo-Christian era of rhetoric, which is much more closer to philosophical type of rhetoric. In this era, it kind of gave me the impression that many people during this era learned far more about themselves and what they believe and what they believe themselves to be, or believe God to be, than any other era of rhetoric that I studied, this semester at least. And one of the examples of this is the fact that they use covenant speech. Covenant speech was supposedly used to pass down God's orders to the first people of Israel. First, it was to remind the people of what God had done for them, so to give thanks to God. Second was to give them orders to carry out, so to make them soldiers of God in a sense, not necessarily soldiers, but give them tasks that God wants them to do here. And third, finally, it was used as a warning for what could happen if God's orders were not carried out. So finally, a threat to make everyone kind of God-fearing, and the covenant speech really helped solidify the church's power in this era, and it was a big part of keeping people in control. During this era, there was also the 4 forms of church rhetoric. So these were the forms of rhetoric that were used in church or by the church, and they're pretty interesting because you can kind of see where and how they kind of go from holy to kind of a different kind of business side. The first one was the missionary sermon, which was the attempt of a missionary to convert a non-Christian to a Christian. And this is, there's many different takes you can have on missionaries, but this is one of those examples. Where it could be considered holy because you're spreading the word of God, but at the same time, we see now that they were kind of just trying to get more and more members to attribute more and more influence. The second was prophetic preaching, which is similar to what Jesus had done. This was the proclaiming of speaking to God and required a very charismatic and convincing orator. The homily, which is still used today, was used by a church official such as a priest or bishop, depending on the mass. And this would be a human-to-human conversation in which the priest is on the same level as the people. So the priest was not a higher member in the religious hierarchy at that time. It was subjects of God speaking to subjects of God. It wasn't necessarily about a priest being more holier than a sinner being less holier than a devout Catholic Christian. Whatever the case was, whatever the individual cases were, this was Son of God or disciple of God speaking to disciple of God. Just the subjects here on planet Earth speaking on the same level, which you don't see very often within the church. So this is very interesting. And finally, the panegyrical sermon, which is used to praise someone or something. This requires the orator to be convincing in order to put value on this someone or something and make it more than what it originally seems to be. Perfect example of this is if you are Catholic, they raise the body and blood of Christ at the end of every Mass. And so this takes a skill. This requires a skill to make this cup that he is holding seem to the audience as if it possibly is Jesus' blood, or this bowl, and make it seem as if it is the body of Christ. And this isn't easy to pull off. It seems like it is from someone who's in the church looking up at the priest, because it kind of seems premeditated. It kind of seems like he's just reading through the script. But he has to have that kind of ambiance about him, and kind of way that makes you believe that this is actually a holy event that you're witnessing. This isn't just somebody telling you that you should value this. This is something that is there for you and was given to you by God. And you should be not only thankful, but you should be in awe at it. And that's not a hard thing to pull off from an orator perspective. And finally, in the Judeo-Christian rhetoric era, you have Augustine's story. Augustine is interesting, especially because he grew up within the rise of Christianity, and he still had the wherewithal and the critical thinking skills to do what he did, which I will tell you now. Augustine was sent to work in law courts when he read Cicero's Hortensius, which caused him to question his mother's religion of Christianity and travel to Carthage to discover other religions. So Augustine had his career path laid out. Augustine had everything that he was supposed to be doing laid out. And he could have easily just continued to be a Christian. He could have easily just became an officer of the court and worked in the law courts. But what he ended up doing after he read Hortensius was he searched for more knowledge. And I think that can be directly correlated with rhetoric, because I think not only did it give him the information that he needed, but it gave him the insight and the ability to speak on what it does for him and what it changed in him and how it changed it and what exactly he might be looking for in another religion. It gave him the direction and the power to critically think and figure out exactly what he wanted. And that's exactly pretty much what I say in the next bullet. Augustine's story is a true example of how rhetoric can permit a person to discover their own self-wisdom through different understandings of teachings, through looking at teachings from a different point of view, from learning it to teaching it, and understanding how teaching it has a completely different perspective, and how you're taught things a certain way because of this different perspective. So he was able to see through, I don't know if he saw through the Christian church, I can't speak that much for him, but he was able to see through the teachings that he was taught and realize why he was being taught these things and what the ultimate goal of the church was. And he didn't agree with that. And so this is not an easy thing to do for a young man with his career laid out for him in that era within the rise of Christianity. He said, no, I want to think for myself. And that, to me, is extremely, extremely inspirational. Augustine's teaching of his own rhetoric expressed the belief that rhetoricians should believe in what they are saying in order to convey true passion. Otherwise, the argument loses some credibility. And I do agree with Augustine here, because I believe that many rhetoricians, if they don't believe exactly what they are saying when they are presenting an argument, or if they're orating it's almost like playing devil's advocate. And because of that, I believe that Augustine was right when he said that orators should convey true passion and truly believe in what they say, because this leads to the audience feeling way more immersed in the subject. If the orator has enough charisma and skill to make you feel immersed and believing in the subject that he's teaching when he doesn't believe it himself, that is incredible skill. But for most people and most orators, that skill is very, very hard to attain. So because of this, it's much easier for any orators or any rhetorician who is presenting to a crowd or presenting to an audience, that to believe in what they actually want to get across and believe in the point that they are saying. Because if they don't believe in it, how can they possibly expect the audience to believe it? And finally, we have Greek rhetoric within the Middle Ages. Greek rhetoric within the Middle Ages is extremely interesting because of all the crazy historical implications there are during this time. It is right after the split of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, and it splits into two: the Latin Church and the Latin Empire in Rome, and then you have the Greek Empire over in Byzantine, which was formerly known as Constantinople and what's known as now as Istanbul. And so the Byzantine Empire, this is all on the eastern side of after the fall of Rome, and the Byzantine Empire was strongly influenced by Greek culture and rhetoric because well before it became Constantinople, it was Byzantine, which was named and founded by the Greeks, and Constantinople then made it a part of the Roman Empire. But when the Roman Empire fell, it was split into its own empire again by itself. So the Byzantine Empire was created after the fall of the Roman Empire, but was strongly influenced by Greek culture, and was kind of, in a way, founded by the Greeks well before Constantine and Rome ever even got there. And during this period, epidictic rhetoric was introduced as a way to praise God, as well as government leaders at the time, for obvious reasons. It was just another way to assert power and get your subjects, whether it was the subjects of the church or the subjects of the government, to have a form of rhetoric to praise you and praise what you are doing, as well as God and what He is doing. And it kind of coincides with the time. Sophist tradition followed the Greek-influenced rhetoricians into the Byzantine Empire, which was also consisted of grammar schools that used progymnasmata to teach grammar about Greek culture and the Greek language. So this just kind of doubles down on the point that this was a very Greek-oriented society, even though it was part of the Roman Empire and branched off as a factor due to the fall of Rome. It really was way more influenced and way more made up of Greek influence and Greek culture and even the Greek language. Rhetoric in the East was taught to those who could afford it, but it was not cheap. This is mainly because Justinian did issue an edict or a law of some sort. I can't tell you exactly what it was or what it meant, but in some ways it did prohibit and limit what teachers could do when it came to rhetoric. I think it really he didn't want it in public schools. It wasn't something that was supposed to be mainstream. And so because of this, because supply went down and the demand went all the way up. And so it was not cheap in the Byzantine Empire to learn rhetoric. Hermogenes was one of the best and most influential teachers in the Byzantine Empire at this time because of his ability to create styles that were useful in speech and writing. Hermogenes also really pushed for using examples and making yourself as clear as possible when orating. He believed that it was the orator's job to provide the exact groundwork for what he wanted the audience to believe he was saying. And so he didn't believe in ambiguity. He didn't believe in any ambiguity. He did not believe in confusing your audience. He believed in providing examples to make sure your audience knew exactly what you were talking about and why you were talking about it. Cassiodorus was another rhetorician who was a Roman-born statesman and believed Christians must read secular works to improve their rhetorician skills. I agree with this because I think reading rhetoric and learning rhetoric really teaches you how to look at things from different perspectives and really can open up your mind to critical thinking. And because of this, I think it's very important, not just for Christians, but any religious person or non-religious person, to get both sides and really kind of understand the perspective of religion itself and not the perspective of a believer or a non-believer, but understand what religion actually is bringing to the table by itself. Attic Greek is a literary form of Greek and was used in formal situations in the Byzantine Empire, for example, to write a letter or to distinguish from the less educated. The use of this language in important and formal settings created a sharp divide between the educated and uneducated in order to prevent the possible loss of history. And so I believe that Attic Greek, while of course was used for formal and informal situations, I think, to me, for some reason, it just kept reminding me of Socrates. And I think it's because Socrates kind of needed something like Attic Greek. And I could be way off, he may have had something, but I believe he needed something kind of like Attic Greek because when he was out in the streets and he was just kind of messing with people and being kind of snarky and taking what their arguments were to him and turning them around on them and really just kind of ticking people off, for lack of a better term. I think the difference between his works and what he did in the street could have been much benefited by the use of Attic Greek if it was present in his society, because it would allow him to write in Attic Greek and maybe even just sit and watch and observe and when he recorded his observations, when he recorded his observations, he would be able to write them in Attic Greek, and people would have more of a sense that this was his studies, that this wasn't him just being Socrates and coming up in your face and making you question your whole reality and making you question what you were saying and why you were saying it. But instead, he was actually using you as a study figure. And I think that's what a lot of people in ancient Greece may have missed, and I think obviously pride plays a big part in that. And I think it eventually led to his death, because I think a lot of people did not like Socrates because of this style, this way that he came out and was not afraid to question you on your beliefs, because he was a very, very intelligent person. But I think that snarkiness and that lack of replacement to show and portray how he was going about his work really kind of hurt him on a social level, and ultimately may have ended up being a big part of his demise. And finally, we have the conclusion. As we have seen, rhetoric has evolved and been preserved through almost every era since its creation. Thanks to many of these great rhetoricians, mentioned and not mentioned, we are still able to know the works of many rhetoricians who may have been lost otherwise. Rhetoric is still vastly important in today's world, and the contributions from each of these eras help provide a blueprint for the succeeding era. And I think that's the most important thing to explain about rhetoric, because that's what kept kind of sticking with me through each chapter, is how in each era, they laid a groundwork for the next era. And that next era respected the previous era so much and enough to translate and modernize those eras' works, the past eras. And so because of this, it allowed each era to have a groundwork and a blueprint to build upon. And so to preserve, or to go back and say, hey, that actually is really important, and pull that into the new era. And I think that's really, really important, because in any field, not just rhetoric, because it allows for great minds to pass on a baton in a way, and you get closer to a solution. I don't think there ever will be a solution to rhetoric and a perfect way to get things across, but I do think that laying a groundwork and a blueprint for the next generations will continue to help us improve on our rhetoric. And it has throughout all these generations, and it will continue. And I think that is the most important thing to leave on. And finally, I will leave my bibliography up. And just want to say, Professor, thank you for a great semester. And I'm really sorry I didn't get to meet you in person, because I really kind of feel like we would have hit it off. And I'm a Lakers fan. I'm the one who kept saying "Go Lakers" in the chat. And I just want to thank you for your patience and just how well you have managed to teach rhetoric in a time where I feel like I really haven't learned anything from school for most of my classes. And I feel like I not only know rhetoric, but I feel like I really truly do understand it. And I owe that to you, and I think you deserve to know how great of a job you did this semester. So thank you. And I hope you have a Merry Christmas.